The year 1917 marked a pivotal moment in world history. The Great War was raging across Europe and empires teetered on the brink of collapse. Amidst this turmoil, a profound transformation was about to unfold in Russia. The Russian Revolution, a seismic event, would reshape the geopolitical landscape for decades. It began with the February Revolution, which saw the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II and the end of the Romanov dynasty. The provisional government struggled to maintain control. Meanwhile, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized the opportunity. Promising peace, land, and bread, they gained support among the war-weary populace. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks launched a daring coup d'état, overthrowing the provisional government. This event, known as the October Revolution, marked the beginning of Soviet rule. To understand the Russian Revolution, one must first delve into the reign of Tsar Nicholas II. Nicholas, a deeply conservative ruler, ascended to the throne in 1894. He inherited a vast empire plagued by social unrest and economic inequality. Tsar Nicholas II. I'm a staunch believer in autocracy and resist any calls for political reform. The Tsar's repressive policies fueled growing discontent among the populace. The Tsarina Alexandra, Nicholas's wife, further exacerbated the situation. Alexandra Fyodorovna, I am deeply religious and have fallen under the sway of Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin's meddling in state affairs eroded public trust in the monarchy. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 proved catastrophic for the Romanov dynasty. Russia's ill-preparedness for the war exposed the deep-seated incompetence within the Tsarist regime. The seeds of revolution had been sown long before the guns of August 1914 erupted across Europe. Russia, a vast empire, was a land of stark contrasts. While the aristocracy lived in opulent palaces, the peasantry toiled in poverty. The 1905 revolution, sparked by Bloody Sunday, had shaken the foundations of Tsarist rule. Though brutally suppressed, it fueled the growth of revolutionary movements. The stage was set for a cataclysmic showdown that would topple centuries-old institutions and unleash radical social experiments. At the dawn of the 20th century, Russia remained a predominantly agrarian society. The vast majority of its population, the peasantry, lived in conditions of poverty and hardship. The emancipation of the serfs in 1861 had done little to alleviate their plight. Peasant woman resentment simmered against the wealthy landowners, who controlled vast estates while we toiled on meager plots. The Tsarist government, seen as out of touch with rural life, offered little relief. While the countryside languished in poverty, Russia's cities were undergoing rapid industrialization. Factories sprung up, drawing in workers from rural areas. These workers, the proletariat, faced harsh conditions and exploitation in factories. Working conditions were often appalling, with long hours, low wages, and dangerous environments. Amidst these harsh realities, new ideas began to take root. Socialism, with its promise of equality and worker control, resonated deeply with the proletariat. The year 1905 marked a turning point in Russian history. A disastrous war with Japan and mounting domestic unrest brought the Tsarist regime to the brink of collapse. The Bloody Sunday massacre ignited a wave of protests and strikes across the empire. Workers formed councils, known as Soviets, to coordinate their actions. Faced with the prospect of revolution, Tsar Nicholas II issued the October Manifesto, promising civil liberties and a parliament. Though ultimately suppressed, the revolution of 1905 had shaken the foundations of Tsarist rule. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 proved to be the catalyst for the Russian Revolution. Initially, the war engendered a wave of patriotic fervor, but this quickly dissipated as Russia suffered humiliating defeats. The war exposed the deep-seated incompetence within the Tsarist regime. The Russian army, ill-equipped and poorly led, suffered staggering losses. Food shortages and inflation eroded the living standards of ordinary Russians. As the war dragged on, discontent with the Tsar and his government reached a fever pitch. World War I proved to be a disaster for Russia. The vast Eastern Front stretched for hundreds of miles. The Russian army, while large, was ill-equipped and poorly led. It faced a German army that was better trained and supplied.
The early years of the war saw a series of humiliating defeats for Russia. At the Battle of Tannenberg, the Russian Second Army was virtually annihilated. The Battle of Masurian Lakes resulted in another crushing defeat.
The Tsar made the fateful decision to assume personal command of the army in 1915, isolating himself from the realities of life in the capital. This decision proved to be a disaster. With the Tsar away at the front, the Tsarina Alexandra took on a more prominent role in government. Alexandra, a German-born princess, was deeply unpopular with the Russian people.
I had fallen under the sway of Grigory Rasputin, who gained influence over me through his purported ability to heal my son Alexei.
Rasputin's influence over the Tsarina became a source of scandal and outrage. The Russian people were appalled by the spectacle of a debauched peasant wielding such power. By the beginning of 1917, Russia was a powder keg waiting to explode. The war had crippled the economy, leading to widespread food shortages and soaring inflation. The spark that ignited the revolution came in February 1917. On International Women's Day, thousands of women took to the streets of Petrograd to protest against food shortages. They were soon joined by striking workers, and the protests quickly escalated into a general uprising. The Tsarist regime, already teetering on the brink, collapsed with astonishing speed. In the aftermath of the February Revolution, two centers of power emerged in Russia. The provisional government, established by the Duma, claimed to represent the legitimate authority of the state. However, its authority was challenged by the Petrograd Soviet, a council of workers' and soldiers' deputies. This situation, known as dual power, created immense political instability. Meanwhile, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, saw an opportunity to seize power. Lenin, exiled in Switzerland, returned to Russia in April 1917 with the help of the German government. Upon his arrival in Petrograd, Lenin wasted no time in outlining his vision for Russia.
In my April thesis, I called for an immediate end to the war, the transfer of land to the peasants, and all power to the Soviets.
Lenin's message resonated powerfully with the war-weary Russian people. The stage was set for a showdown that would determine the fate of Russia. The summer of 1917 was a time of escalating tension and violence in Petrograd. The provisional government faced growing pressure from both the left and the right. On July 3rd, spontaneous demonstrations erupted in Petrograd. Workers and soldiers, frustrated by the government's inaction, took to the streets. The demonstrations quickly spiraled out of control, clashing with government forces. The July days demonstrated the fragility of the provisional government's hold on power and the growing strength of the Bolsheviks. The July days had a profound impact on the political landscape of Russia. Alexander Kerensky became prime minister, promising to restore order and continue the war effort. However, Kerensky's position was precarious, facing opposition from both the left and the right. General Lava Kornilov, the newly appointed commander-in-chief of the Russian army, saw an opportunity.
Kornilov believed that Russia's salvation lay in crushing the revolution and restoring the Tsar to the throne. In late August 1917, Kornilov ordered his troops to march on Petrograd.
Section 3. The Road to October, Lenin's Gamble. The Kornilov affair, as it came to be known, had far-reaching consequences for the Russian Revolution. Kerensky, realizing that he could not rely on the army to suppress the coup, was forced to turn to the Petrograd Soviet for help. The Soviet, including the Bolsheviks, mobilized workers and soldiers to defend the capital. Kornilov's coup was quickly defeated, and he was arrested. The Kornilov affair had a profound impact on the balance of power in Russia. It discredited the right, exposing their willingness to use force to achieve their aims. It also strengthened the hand of the Bolsheviks, who emerged from the crisis as the saviors of the revolution.
Lenin, who had been in hiding in Finland during the July days, now sensed that the time was ripe for the Bolsheviks to seize power. Lenin argued that the provisional government was beyond saving, and that only a Bolshevik-led government could extricate Russia from the war and implement the radical social and economic changes that he believed were necessary. However, not all Bolsheviks shared Lenin's conviction. Some feared that a seizure of power would be premature and would lead to a bloody civil war.
Section 4. The Storming of the Winter Palace, Symbols of Change. Despite the reservations of some of his comrades, Lenin prevailed. On October 24th, November 6th in the Gregorian calendar, the Bolsheviks, with the support of leftist elements within the Petrograd Soviet, launched their bid for power. Armed workers and soldiers loyal to the Bolsheviks seized key strategic points in Petrograd, including the telegraph offices, railway stations and power plants. The provisional government, holed up in the Winter Palace, seemed powerless to resist. Kerensky fled the capital in a desperate attempt to rally loyal troops. Inside the Winter Palace, the remaining ministers debated their options. Some argued for a last-ditch defense, while others favored surrender. As night fell, the Bolsheviks surrounded the Winter Palace. At around 2 a.m. on October 26th, a detachment of Bolshevik sailors and Red Guards stormed the palace. The defenders, outnumbered and demoralized, put up little resistance. The provisional government was arrested, and the Bolsheviks declared victory.
While the fate of Russia hung in the balance on the streets of Petrograd, the Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for over 3 centuries, met its ignominious end.
After his abdication in February 1917, Nicholas II and his family had been placed under house arrest by the provisional government. They were initially held at the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, outside Petrograd, before being moved to Tobolsk in Siberia. Following the Bolshevik seizure of power, the Romanovs' fate was sealed.
The Bolsheviks viewed the former Tsar and his family as symbols of the old order, obstacles to the creation of a new socialist society. In April 1918, the Romanovs were moved to Yekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains. They were imprisoned in the Ipatiev house, a merchant's mansion that had been requisitioned by the Bolsheviks.
On the night of July 16th to 17th, 1918, Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children and 4 faithful retainers were taken to the basement of the Ipatiev house and executed by a detachment of Bolshevik secret police. The execution was brutal and chaotic, and the bodies were hastily disposed of in a nearby mine shaft. The Romanov dynasty, once the epitome of autocratic power, had been extinguished.
The streets of Petrograd, still echoing with the sounds of revolution, bore witness to a momentous shift in power. The Bolsheviks, once a radical fringe group, had seized control of the government.
Lenin, recently returned from exile, emerged as the leader of this new Russia, a nation teetering on the precipice of radical transformation. The Winter Palace, symbol of Tsarist opulence, stood as a silent testament to the swiftness and brutality of the revolution. The provisional government, plagued by indecision and weakened by internal divisions, proved no match for the Bolsheviks' ruthless efficiency.
The workers and soldiers of Petrograd, weary of war and hunger, rallied behind Lenin's promises of peace, land, and bread. The Bolsheviks, masters of propaganda, presented themselves as the true representatives of the people's will.
The success of the October Revolution sent shockwaves throughout Russia and the world. Here, in the heart of a crumbling empire, a new social order was being forged, one that challenged the very foundations of capitalism and traditional power structures. The Bolsheviks, inspired by Marxist ideology aimed to create a classless society where workers controlled the means of production. The world watched with a mixture of fascination and trepidation. Could this fledgling socialist state, born out of chaos and bloodshed, truly succeed? Or would it crumble under the weight of its own ambitions and the inevitable counter-revolutionary forces, gathering strength both within and outside Russia's borders? With the Bolsheviks firmly in control, Lenin moved swiftly to consolidate his power and implement his revolutionary agenda. He dissolved the Constituent Assembly, elected to create a new Russian constitution after it became clear that the Bolsheviks would not hold a majority. This act signaled a decisive break from democratic principles and ushered in a one-party state controlled by the Communist Party, the new name for the Bolsheviks. Lenin, a pragmatist despite his revolutionary zeal, understood the need to quell the chaos engulfing Russia. He signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, ending Russia's involvement in the First World War but ceding vast territories to the Germans. This unpopular move, seen as a betrayal by some, was necessary in Lenin's view to allow the Bolsheviks to focus on consolidating their power and building a socialist state. On March 12, 1921, with the revolution still raging in parts of the former Russian Empire, the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, RSFSR, formally came into being. Soon it would become the nucleus of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, or Soviet Union, a vast new entity encompassing much of the former Tsarist Empire. The Soviet Union, a federation of republics based on the principle of democratic centralism, aimed to create a classless society where workers controlled the means of production. The reality, however, would prove far more complex and brutal than this utopian vision. Section 3. The Red Terror consolidating power through fear. The triumph of the October Revolution had not brought peace to Russia. Instead, it ignited a brutal civil war that would engulf the country for the next 5 years. The Bolsheviks, facing opposition from a disparate coalition of forces known as the Whites, resorted to increasingly ruthless measures to consolidate their power and crush any dissent. The Cheka, the Bolsheviks' secret police force, became the instrument of this repression. Under the leadership of Felix Dzerzhinsky, a Polish aristocrat turned revolutionary fanatic, the Cheka unleashed a wave of terror known as the Red Terror. Suspected enemies of the revolution, former Tsarist officials, landowners, intellectuals, even those deemed insufficiently enthusiastic about the Bolshevik cause, were arrested, tortured, and executed without trial. The Red Terror, justified by the Bolsheviks as a necessary evil to secure the revolution, left a bloody stain on the early years of the Soviet state. It created an atmosphere of fear and paranoia, silencing opposition and consolidating the Communist Party's grip on power. The brutality of the Cheka, operating with impunity, served as a chilling reminder of the human cost of revolutionary upheaval. The Red Terror, while effective in crushing dissent, also sowed the seeds of future repression. It established a precedent for state-sanctioned violence and terror that would continue to haunt Russia long after the Civil War had ended. Section 4. Civil War erupts, a nation divided. The Russian Civil War, a bloody and chaotic struggle for the soul of a nation, pitted the Bolshevik Red Army against the loosely allied White forces. The Whites, representing a hodgepodge of political ideologies from monarchists to moderate socialists, shared a common enemy in the Bolsheviks. The Whites, backed by foreign powers who feared the spread of communism, received military and financial aid from Britain, France, Japan, and the United States. The Bolsheviks, however, controlled the industrial heartland of Russia and benefited from the military leadership of Leon Trotsky, who proved to be a brilliant strategist.
The Civil War raged across the vast expanse of the former Russian Empire. From the frozen steppes of Ukraine to the mountains of the Caucasus, brother fought brother in a conflict marked by brutality and atrocities on both sides. Millions of Russians perished, not only in battle, but also from famine, disease, and the terror inflicted by both the Reds and the Whites. The Civil War, a defining moment in early Soviet history, tested the Bolsheviks' resolve and shaped the character of the Soviet state. It was a crucible from which the Red Army emerged victorious, but at a terrible cost. The war left Russia devastated, its economy in ruins, its people traumatized by years of violence and deprivation.
Section 1. War, Communism, Survival at Any Cost. As the Russian Civil War raged, the Bolsheviks implemented a series of radical economic policies known as war communism. Faced with a collapsing economy, widespread famine, and the need to supply the Red Army, they resorted to extreme measures to mobilize resources and maintain control. Private ownership of industry was abolished, and factories were placed under state control. Grain requisitioning, already practiced during the war, became systematic. Peasants were forced to surrender their surplus grain to feed the cities and the army, often at gunpoint. This policy, while essential for supplying the Red Army, alienated the peasantry, the very people the Bolsheviks claimed to represent. To combat rampant inflation and speculation, the Bolsheviks abolished money as legal tender. Instead, they introduced a system of barter and ration cards. This measure, though intended to create economic equality, led to widespread shortages and a thriving black market. War communism, a brutal but necessary response to the exigencies of civil war, exacted a heavy toll on the Russian people. Industrial production plummeted, cities faced chronic food shortages, and the peasantry was driven to the brink of revolt. By 1921, with the Civil War drawing to a close, Russia lay in ruins, its economy in shambles, its people exhausted and disillusioned. Section 2. The New Economic Policy, a Necessary Compromise. With the Civil War won, the Bolsheviks faced the daunting task of rebuilding a shattered nation. In 1921, Lenin announced the New Economic Policy, or NEP. The NEP represented a temporary truce between the Bolsheviks and the peasantry. While the state retained control of large industries, small-scale private enterprise was permitted. The NEP had a dramatic impact on the Soviet economy. Within a few years, agricultural production had recovered to pre-war levels. The NEP, a pragmatic compromise, proved to be an economic success, but it also created new challenges. Section 3. The death of Lenin and the rise of Stalin. On January 21, 1924, Vladimir Lenin died at the age of 53. His death created a power vacuum at the top of the Communist Party. A struggle for succession ensued between Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin.
Trotsky embodied the internationalist ideals of the revolution.
Stalin was a master of bureaucratic maneuvering and backroom deals. He advocated for socialism in one country.
The struggle was a fundamental disagreement over the Soviet Union's future. Stalin outmaneuvered his rivals and emerged as the undisputed dictator. Trotsky was exiled in 1929 and assassinated in 1940. Section 4. Forging a totalitarian state. The Soviet experiment begins. With Stalin in control, the Soviet Union embarked on a radical transformation. Stalin's 5-year plans aimed for forced industrialization and collectivization. Collectivization consolidated peasant holdings into state-run farms. Kulaks were targeted for elimination. Millions of peasants were forcibly relocated. Forced collectivization led to famine and social upheaval. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union became a totalitarian state. Section 1. Legacies of Revolution. The Russian Revolution stands as a pivotal event of the 20th century. It toppled a centuries-old dynasty and birthed the Soviet Union, a superpower shaping global politics. The revolution's legacy is complex, marked by achievements and horrors. It ushered in unprecedented social and economic change. The Bolsheviks, inspired by Marxist ideology, implemented sweeping reforms. However, noble ideals were eclipsed by totalitarian rule. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union faced terror and repression. The The revolution's impact extended globally, inspiring communist movements. The Cold War, a global ideological struggle, shaped international relations. The Russian Revolution serves as a cautionary tale about utopianism and absolute power. It reminds us of enduring human aspirations for freedom, equality, and social justice.